The gunshot cracked through Maplewood's peaceful Saturday afternoon like thunder from a clear sky. 12-year-old Emma Sullivan's scream tore through the air, raw, primal, devastating, as Liberty, her golden-brown German shepherd, crumpled to the blood-soaked pavement of Main Street. This wasn't supposed to happen in their quiet Vermont town where everyone knew everyone. Mrs. Rose Sullivan dropped her watering can from the front porch, ceramic shattering against wooden steps as she watched her granddaughter collapse beside the dying dog. The elderly woman's weathered hands trembled as she fumbled for her phone, muscle memory dialing the emergency number that would reach halfway across the world to a classified military location. Officer Ryan Brooks stood motionless, service weapon still extended, a thin wisp of smoke curling from the barrel. No remorse flickered in his cold eyes as Emma's desperate hands pressed against Liberty's wound, crimson spreading between her small fingers. "Please don't leave me," Emma whispered to her dying best friend. What Brooks didn't know was that Liberty's death had just awakened the most lethal Delta Force commander in American military history, and he was coming home. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, the Sullivan family had arrived in Maplewood like so many military families before them, carrying hope in their hearts and wounds they couldn't name. The colonial house on Maple Street wasn't grand, but it represented something precious, a fresh start after unimaginable loss. Emma Sullivan had been 8 when autism entered her world like an uninvited guest, making social connections feel like navigating a foreign language without a translator. 2 years later, when cancer stole her mother Michelle in a devastating car accident during a Vermont snowstorm, Emma's world shrank to the size of her bedroom. Words became enemies. Silence became her shield. Colonel Jack Sullivan, at 42, carried the weight of classified missions across 3 continents, but nothing had prepared him for single parenthood. His broad shoulders, which had borne the responsibility of protecting his country, now struggled under the crushing guilt of leaving his daughter for 8 months each year. The medals, locked away in his safe, meant nothing compared to the hollow look in Emma's dark eyes when he returned from deployment. Enter Rose Sullivan, 75 years of Vermont granite wrapped in flannel and fierce love. Jack's mother had taught special education for 43 years before retiring, and she moved into the Maple Street house without invitation or hesitation. "That child needs consistency," she declared, unpacking her china in Michelle's old cabinets. "And you need someone to hold down the fort while you're off saving the world." But it was Liberty who truly saved them all. The 5-year-old German Shepherd arrived through the military's service dog program, 70 pounds of gentle intelligence wrapped in a sable coat. Her previous family had surrendered her after a tragic incident involving a child, but the rehabilitation center had transformed her into something extraordinary. A dog who could sense panic attacks before they started, who understood when Emma needed pressure therapy, who somehow knew that gentle persistence could coax words from a grieving child. Liberty didn't just live with the Sullivans. She became their translator, their bridge between heartbreak and healing. When Emma's nightmares came, visions of her mother's twisted car in the snow, Liberty would pad silently to her bedside, placing her massive head on the child's chest until the trembling stopped. Maplewood itself seemed designed for healing. The town of 3,200 souls nestled in a valley where maple trees stood sentinel over white clapboard houses and front porches that invited conversation. Main Street stretched 6 blocks from Murphy's Tavern to the elementary school, lined with businesses that had served generations of families. The War Memorial in the town square honored local boys who'd served from the revolution through Afghanistan, and the community embraced military families with the kind of genuine warmth that made Jack wonder if he'd finally found home. What none of them knew was that their arrival had awakened something dark in Maplewood, a hatred that had festered for 5 long years, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Officer Ryan Brooks had been watching, planning, nursing his rage like a cancer that grew stronger with each passing day. The September afternoon wrapped Maplewood in golden light as Emma clipped Liberty's leash to her collar, the familiar ritual bringing comfort to both girl and dog. Jack had been deployed for 3 weeks now, one of his shorter missions he'd promised, and their daily walks had become Emma's anchor to normalcy while her father served overseas. "We're going to visit Mama today," Emma whispered to Liberty, who tilted her intelligent head as if understanding every word. The German shepherd's tail swept gentle arcs across the hardwood floor, but something in her demeanor seemed different today. Her ears kept swiveling toward the windows, and she'd been restless all morning, following Emma from room to room with unusual intensity. Rose looked up from her crossword puzzle at the kitchen table, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. "Stay on the main paths, sweetheart," she reminded Emma, though they both knew Liberty would never let her charge wander into danger. "And be back before supper. I'm making your favorite pot roast." The walk to Maplewood Cemetery took them down familiar streets where neighbors waved from porches and Liberty received her usual share of attention. Mrs. Henderson, 82 and sharp as her late husband's army knife, called out from her garden where she was tending late-season roses. "Looking handsome today, Liberty girl," she said, and Liberty's tail wagged politely, though she didn't deviate from her path beside Emma. The old woman had been a teacher too, before Rose, and she understood the special bond between the quiet child and her 4-legged guardian. As they walked, Emma chattered softly to Liberty about school, about the book she was reading, about how much she missed Daddy. Liberty listened with the patience of a saint, occasionally glancing up at Emma's face as if checking her emotional temperature. It was a game they played, Emma talking through her feelings while Liberty provided the safe, non-judgmental audience she needed. The cemetery sat on a gentle hill at the edge of town, its weathered headstones standing like silent sentinels among the maple trees. Michelle Sullivan's grave was marked by a simple granite stone that read, "Beloved wife and mother," beneath her name and dates. Emma had chosen the inscription herself, with Rose's help, because those words captured everything that mattered. "Hi, Mama," Emma said softly, kneeling beside the headstone while Liberty settled beside her, alert but calm. "Liberty's been taking care of me, just like you said she would. She helped me with my math homework yesterday. Well, she sat with me while I figured it out, and she reminded me to brush my teeth this morning when I forgot." Liberty's ears suddenly pricked forward, and a low rumble emanated from her chest. Not quite a growl, but a warning. Emma looked up to see a police cruiser rolling slowly past the cemetery gates, and she felt a flutter of unease. Liberty rarely reacted to police cars, but today, something was different. The cruiser passed, then made a U-turn and parked at the cemetery entrance. 2 officers emerged, one older with graying temples and a face that looked like it had seen too much, and a younger man with close-cropped dark hair and eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. "Good afternoon," the older officer called out as they approached. His name tag read Brooks, and his voice carried the false friendliness that even Emma's autism couldn't miss. "Beautiful day for a walk, isn't it?" Liberty rose to her feet, positioning herself slightly in front of Emma, not aggressively but protectively. Her training kicked in automatically. Assess the threat, protect the charge, de-escalate when possible. "Yes, sir," Emma replied politely, the way her father had taught her to address authority figures. But Liberty's tension was contagious, and Emma found herself gripping the leash tighter than necessary. "That's a big dog for a little girl," the younger officer observed, his hand resting casually near his service weapon. "You sure you can handle an animal that size?" "Liberty is trained," Emma said, her voice growing smaller as the officer stepped closer. "She's not going to cause any trouble. She's a good dog." Brooks' eyes never left Liberty's face, and something dark flickered in his expression, recognition mixed with something that looked almost like hunger. "What kind of training?" he asked, his tone sharpening. "She's a service dog," Emma explained, confusion creeping into her voice. "She helps me when I get scared or sad. My daddy got her from the military program." The moment the words left her mouth, Emma knew she'd said something wrong. Brooks' entire demeanor changed, his casual stance shifting to something more predatory. Liberty sensed it too, her hackles rising slightly as she took a half-step forward. "Military program," Brooks repeated slowly, his eyes now fixed on Liberty with an intensity that made Emma's stomach twist. "And where exactly is your daddy right now, sweetheart?" Emma's hands began to tremble as Officer Brooks stepped closer, his shadow falling across her mother's grave like a dark omen. Liberty immediately sensed her distress, moving to place herself squarely between the child and the approaching officer. The German shepherd's posture remained calm but alert, exactly as she'd been trained, but her intelligent brown eyes never left Brooks' face. "My daddy is away on business," Emma said quietly, backing closer to her mother's headstone. The familiar granite felt solid against her legs, an anchor in a suddenly unstable world. "He'll be home soon." Brooks exchanged a meaningful glance with his partner, Officer Walsh, who looked increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Walsh was younger, newer to the force, and the predatory gleam in his senior partner's eyes made him shift nervously from foot to foot. "Business?" Brooks repeated, his voice dripping with false concern. "That's convenient. And I suppose your grandmother doesn't know you're wandering around town alone with this animal?" The word animal came out like a curse, and Liberty's ears flattened slightly against her head. She remained in position, her training overriding every instinct that told her to either flee or fight. Emma reached down instinctively to touch Liberty's head, finding comfort in the familiar softness of her fur. "Grandma Rose knows where I am," Emma said, her voice growing smaller as her autism made it harder to process the social dynamics swirling around her. "We always come to visit Mama on Saturdays. Liberty likes to sit with me while I talk to her." From her position across the street, Mrs. Henderson had noticed the police interaction and felt a familiar teacher's instinct kick in. Something wasn't right about the way that older officer was looking at the child and her dog. She fumbled for her phone, her arthritic fingers struggling with the buttons as she began recording, though she wasn't sure why. "That's a dangerous breed," Brooks continued, circling slightly so that Emma had to turn to keep him in sight. Liberty moved with her, maintaining her protective position with the fluid grace of a well-trained guardian. German shepherds have been known to attack without warning, especially when they're protecting their territory. "Liberty doesn't attack people," Emma said, confusion evident in her voice. "She helps people. She helps me when I have bad dreams about Mama. She knows when I'm sad before I even know it myself." Brooks' laugh was cold, devoid of any warmth or humor. "Is that what they told you? That this beast is some kind of therapy dog?" He took another step forward, and for the first time, Liberty let out a low, warning sound, not a growl, but a rumble deep in her chest that spoke of barely contained protective instincts. Walsh finally found his voice. "Brooks, maybe we should—" "Control your dog," Brooks snapped at Emma, his hand moving to rest on his weapon. "Step away from it, now!" Emma's world began to tilt on its axis. The police were supposed to help people, weren't they? That's what her father had always told her. But the man standing before her looked nothing like a helper. His eyes held something dark and hungry, something that made Liberty's hackles rise and Emma's heart pound against her ribs. "I don't understand," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "What did we do wrong? We're just visiting my mama." The September afternoon that had begun so peacefully was transforming into something else entirely, something that would echo through the quiet streets of Maplewood for months to come. In the distance, Mrs. Henderson's phone continued recording, capturing every word, every gesture, every moment as the situation spiraled toward an ending that none of them could have imagined. Liberty pressed closer to Emma's leg, her warm presence the only constant in a world that had suddenly become frightening and unpredictable. The tension in the cemetery air grew thick as molasses as Brooks's hand remained poised near his weapon, his eyes fixed on Liberty with an intensity that made Emma's stomach churn. The German shepherd remained perfectly still, her training warring with every protective instinct screaming at her to act. She had been taught to de-escalate, to calm, to comfort. But the man before her radiated a malevolence that set every nerve in her body on edge. "Step away from the dog," Brooks repeated, his voice carrying the false authority of someone who had grown accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I won't ask again." Emma's autism made it difficult for her to process rapidly changing social situations, and the conflicting signals she was receiving, police officer equals safety, but this man's behavior equals danger, created a cognitive dissonance that left her frozen in place. Her hands found Liberty's collar, fingers twisting in the familiar leather as she tried to make sense of what was happening. "Please," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle rustle of maple leaves overhead. "We're not doing anything wrong. Liberty's a good dog. She's never hurt anyone." From her vantage point across the street, Mrs. Henderson's teacher instincts were screaming danger. She had worked with special needs children for over 30 years, and she recognized the signs of a child in distress. Her phone continued recording as she dialed 911 with her other hand, whispering urgently to the dispatcher about a situation developing at the cemetery. Brooks took another step forward, and Liberty's body language shifted almost imperceptibly. Her weight moved to her front paws, her stance widening slightly, not aggressive, but ready. She was a wall between Emma and whatever threat this man represented, and she would hold that position until her last breath if necessary. "That animal is showing signs of aggression," Brooks announced, his voice carrying across the cemetery with practiced authority. "I can see it in its posture, its behavior. It's preparing to attack." Officer Walsh looked from his partner to the dog and back again, confusion evident on his young face. "Brooks, I don't see. The dog isn't doing anything wrong. It's just sitting there." "You don't have the experience to read canine behavior," Brooks snapped without taking his eyes off Liberty. "That dog is a threat, and I'm going to neutralize it before someone gets hurt." Emma's world began to fragment as the words sank in. Her processing delays meant she understood the implications a few seconds after they were spoken, and when comprehension hit, it felt like a physical blow to her chest. "No," she said, her voice growing stronger with desperation. "No, you can't hurt Liberty. She's all I have. Please, I'll call my grandma. She can explain." "It's too late for explanations," Brooks said, drawing his weapon with the smooth efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. "Step away from the animal. Final warning." Liberty sensed the escalation before anyone else did. Her training told her to remain calm, to de-escalate, to protect through presence rather than aggression. But her deeper instincts, the ones bred into German shepherds for centuries, recognized mortal danger when she saw it. She shifted her position slightly, placing more of her body between Emma and the gun now pointed in their direction. "No, no, no," Emma began repeating, her voice rising as her limited coping mechanisms crumbled under the weight of the situation. She began to rock slightly, a self-soothing behavior that Liberty had learned to recognize and respond to. In any other situation, the dog would have moved to provide deep pressure therapy, would have grounded Emma with her weight and warmth, but Liberty couldn't move. Moving meant leaving Emma exposed, and that was unthinkable. Walsh finally stepped forward, his own training telling him that the situation was spiraling out of control. "Brooks, wait. Let's just call animal control. We can handle this without—" "Without what?" Brooks turned on his partner with sudden fury. "Without doing our job? Without protecting this community from dangerous animals? That dog has been flagged as aggressive, and I'm not going to stand here and wait for it to attack a child." The lie came so smoothly that Walsh almost believed it. But he had seen the reports, had worked alongside Brooks for 2 years, and something about this situation felt wrong. The dog wasn't showing any signs of aggression that he could see. If anything, it looked protective, maternal almost, the way it kept itself positioned between the child and any perceived threat. Mrs. Henderson's voice carried across the cemetery as she continued her urgent conversation with the 911 dispatcher. "Yes, there's an officer with his gun drawn on a child and her service dog. The situation is escalating rapidly. Please send someone immediately." Brooks heard her and his face contorted with rage. "Ma'am, step back and stop interfering with police business," he shouted. "This is a dangerous situation and you need to clear the area." But Mrs. Henderson had taught teenagers for 3 decades and had faced down school boards, angry parents, and bureaucrats without flinching. She wasn't about to be intimidated by a bully with a badge. "I'm documenting what I'm seeing," she called back. "And what I'm seeing is an officer threatening a child and her therapy dog for no apparent reason." Emma's rocking intensified as the voices grew louder around her. Liberty felt her distress and took a half-step closer, her massive head turning to offer comfort even as she maintained her protective stance. The movement was subtle, natural, the kind of adjustment any dog might make. But to Brooks, focused as he was on his own demons and the target of 5 years of festering hatred, it looked like aggressive posturing. "There!" he shouted, his voice cracking with vindication. "Did you see that? The animal is moving into attack position. It's going to lunge." Walsh looked at the dog again, seeing only what he had seen before. A trained animal providing comfort to a distressed child. But Brooks was his training officer, his senior partner, and the man who would write his evaluations. The weight of institutional loyalty pressed down on him like a physical force. Emma looked up at Liberty, seeing her beloved companion caught in an impossible situation. The dog who had saved her from countless nightmares, who had given her the courage to speak again after her mother's death, who had been her constant companion through every difficult moment of the past 18 months. Liberty's brown eyes met hers, and in them Emma saw love, loyalty, and an unshakable determination to protect her no matter the cost. "Please, don't hurt her," Emma whispered, tears streaming down her face as she realized that all the adults around her, the people who were supposed to protect children and animals, were failing in the most fundamental way possible. Brooks's finger moved to the trigger, and Liberty's ears pricked forward slightly as she sensed the change in his body language. She had no way of knowing what was coming, but her love for Emma was absolute, unwavering, and complete. She would not move. She would not abandon her post. Whatever happened next, Emma would be safe behind the wall of her love. Time seemed to crystallize in that perfect September afternoon as Brooks' finger tightened on the trigger. Liberty's ears had flattened against her head, not in aggression but in the universal canine expression of submission and fear. Yet she held her ground, her powerful body trembling slightly as every instinct screamed at her to flee, while her love for Emma kept her rooted in place. Emma watched in slow-motion horror as she saw the determination in Brooks' eyes, the way his jaw set with grim satisfaction. This wasn't about police work or public safety. This was something personal, something dark that she couldn't understand but could feel radiating from him like heat from a furnace. "Liberty," she whispered, her voice breaking with the weight of impending loss. "Good girl. Stay." The words were barely audible, but Liberty heard them, and her tail gave one small, brave wag in response. Even facing death, she found comfort in Emma's voice, in the familiar commands that had structured their life together. Her brown eyes, so intelligent and full of love, never left Emma's face. Mrs. Henderson's phone captured every second as she continued recording, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. She had seen enough tragedy in her 82 years to recognize when something irreversible was about to happen, and her voice cracked as she pleaded with the 911 dispatcher for immediate assistance. Officer Walsh found his voice at the last possible moment. "Brooks, don't—" The gunshot cracked across the cemetery like thunder, echoing off the weathered headstones and sending a flock of starlings into panicked flight. The sound seemed to go on forever, bouncing between the maple trees and rolling across the peaceful streets of Maplewood like a declaration of war against innocence itself. Liberty's body jerked as the bullet found its mark, her powerful frame stumbling backward before her legs gave way. She collapsed onto the grass beside Michelle Sullivan's grave, crimson spreading across her golden coat with terrifying speed. Her breathing became labored, each breath a visible struggle, but her eyes remained fixed on Emma with unwavering devotion. Emma's scream tore through the afternoon air, raw, primal, a sound no child should ever have to make. She dropped to her knees beside Liberty, her small hands pressing desperately against the wound as she had seen in movies, as if love and determination could somehow staunch the flow of life itself. "No, no, no," Emma chanted, her voice rising to a pitch that made even Brooks take a step backward. "Liberty, stay with me. Please stay with me. Daddy's coming home." "He's coming home and he's going to fix you." Liberty's tail thumped once against the ground, a final effort to comfort the child she loved more than her own life. Her muzzle found Emma's face, and she managed one last gentle kiss before her strength began to ebb away. Brooks stood with his weapon still extended, watching the scene with cold satisfaction. "Animal's been neutralized," he said into his radio, his voice steady and professional. "Situation under control." But Walsh was staring at the dying dog with growing horror, watching as Liberty's blood soaked into the earth around Michelle Sullivan's grave. This wasn't what he had signed up for when he joined the force. This wasn't protecting and serving. This was something else entirely, something that made his stomach churn with revulsion. "She wasn't attacking," Walsh said quietly, his voice barely audible above Emma's sobs. "Brooks, she wasn't attacking anyone." "The animal showed clear signs of aggression," Brooks replied, holstering his weapon with practiced ease. "I responded according to protocol. You witnessed the threatening behavior." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Walsh felt the weight of institutional pressure crushing down on him. He was young, new, still on probation. Brooks was a 20-year veteran with commendations and connections throughout the department. Who would believe his word against his training officers? Emma's hands were covered in Liberty's blood now, the warm liquid seeping between her fingers as she tried desperately to hold her best friend together through sheer force of will. Liberty's breathing was becoming more labored, her beautiful brown eyes beginning to dim, but she fought to stay conscious for just a few more moments. "I love you," Emma whispered, her tears falling onto Liberty's fur. "I love you so much. You're the best girl. The goodest girl who ever lived." Liberty's tail gave one last weak thump at the familiar words, their bedtime ritual, their morning greeting, their constant refrain throughout 18 months of healing and growth together. Her eyes found Emma's one final time, and in them was everything that mattered. Love without condition, loyalty without question, and a peace that came from knowing she had done exactly what she was born to do. As Liberty's breathing stilled and the light faded from her eyes, something fundamental shifted in the universe of Maplewood. The innocence that had protected this small Vermont town for generations cracked like ice in spring, and through that crack seeped something dark and unforgivable. Mrs. Henderson's sobbing carried across the cemetery as she continued filming, her phone capturing not just the death of a beloved dog, but the death of trust itself. She had seen enough in her long life to know that some moments change everything, and this was one of them. Brooks looked down at Emma, still cradling Liberty's still form, and felt nothing but satisfaction. After 5 years of planning, of waiting, of nursing his hatred like a cancer, he had finally gotten his revenge. The dog that had destroyed his family was dead, and the little girl who had dared to love her was learning the same lesson his son had learned, that the world was cruel and unpredictable, and that sometimes the monsters wore badges. What Brooks didn't know was that 3,000 miles away, an encrypted satellite phone was buzzing in a classified location, carrying news that would bring the most lethal soldier in the United States military home to discover that his greatest enemy had been hiding in plain sight. The real war was about to begin. The emergency room at Maplewood General had seen its share of trauma over the years, but nothing quite like the sight of 12-year-old Emma Sullivan being carried through the automatic doors by her grandmother, both of them covered in Liberty's blood. Emma hadn't spoken a word since Liberty died in her arms, her dark eyes staring at nothing as if her soul had followed her beloved companion into whatever realm awaited faithful dogs. Rose Sullivan's face was a mask of controlled fury as she held her granddaughter close, feeling the child's small body trembling with shock. At 75, Rose had weathered many storms: the death of her husband, the struggles of raising a military son, the devastating loss of her daughter-in-law. But watching Emma's world shatter had awakened something fierce and protective that she hadn't felt since Jack was small. She witnessed a traumatic event, Dr. Sarah Chen explained softly as she examined Emma's unresponsive state. The blood on her clothes, the way she's withdrawn, this level of shock in a child, especially one on the autism spectrum, can have lasting effects. We need to get her cleaned up and into some fresh clothes, then we'll run some assessments. 3 hours later, Emma sat in a hospital bed wearing a soft pink gown, her small hands clutching Liberty's collar, the only thing the paramedics had been able to remove from the scene before animal control arrived. She hadn't acknowledged the doctor's questions, hadn't responded to Rose's gentle encouragement, hadn't even cried. The silence was more frightening than screams would have been. Rose stepped into the hallway where Sheriff Morrison waited with Brooks and Walsh, their faces carefully composed masks of professional concern. At 68, Morrison had the weathered look of a man who had spent his career managing small-town problems. But there was something calculating in his pale blue eyes that made Rose's teacher instincts recoil. "Mrs. Sullivan," Morrison began, his voice carrying the false sympathy of a funeral director, "I want you to know how sorry we are about what happened today. Officer Brooks followed proper protocol when faced with an aggressive animal, but we understand this is traumatic for your granddaughter." Rose's gray eyes flashed with a fury that had once reduced classroom bullies to tears. "Aggressive animal?" she repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. "Sheriff Morrison, I've lived in this town for 75 years. I taught your children in Sunday school, and I'm telling you right now that what I heard described by Mrs. Henderson bears no resemblance to proper protocol." Brooks stepped forward, his expression earnest and concerned. "Ma'am, I understand your grief, but German Shepherds are powerful animals with strong protective instincts. When the dog positioned itself between me and the child in an aggressive stance, Liberty positioned herself protectively," Rose interrupted, her voice growing stronger with each word. "There's a difference between protection and aggression, and any competent officer should know that. That dog spent 18 months learning to comfort my granddaughter, not attack innocent people. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but Emma's voice suddenly cut through the tension, small, broken, but carrying the devastating clarity that sometimes comes with trauma. "She died protecting me," Emma whispered from her hospital bed, her first word since the shooting. "Liberty died because she loved me." Rose rushed back to Emma's side, gathering the child in her arms as the dam finally broke and the tears came, great gulping sobs that seemed to tear themselves from Emma's chest. "She's gone, Grandma Rose. She's gone, and I couldn't save her. I tried to stop the bleeding, but I couldn't save her." In the hallway, Walsh shifted uncomfortably as he listened to the child's grief. The sounds cut through his professional detachment like a knife, forcing him to confront the reality of what he had witnessed in that cemetery. The dog hadn't been aggressive, the child had been innocent, and he had stood by and watched it happen. Later that evening, as Emma finally slept under mild sedation, Rose sat beside her bed making phone calls with the grim determination of a woman who had taught teenagers for 43 years. She called her congressman's office, demanding answers. She called the state police, filing complaints. She called every news outlet within 100 miles, telling them about a child whose service dog had been murdered by police. But most importantly, she called the emergency number that would reach Colonel Jack Sullivan wherever his classified mission had taken him. The conversation was brief. Operational security limited what could be said over unsecured lines, but the message was clear. Come home now, your daughter needs you, and justice needs to be served. As Rose ended the call, she looked out the hospital window at the lights of Maplewood twinkling in the darkness. Somewhere out there, Brooks and Morrison thought they had won, thought their badges and their brotherhood would protect them from the consequences of what they had done. They had no idea that they had just declared war on the wrong family. 3 days after Liberty's death, Colonel Jack Sullivan stepped off a military transport at Burlington International Airport, his weathered face carved from granite and his green eyes burning with a cold fury that made seasoned soldiers step aside. The emergency extraction from his classified mission had taken 72 hours. 72 hours during which his daughter had remained largely catatonic, speaking only to ask when Daddy was coming home to fix Liberty. Rose met him at the airport, her usually impeccable silver hair disheveled and her eyes red-rimmed from sleepless nights spent watching over Emma. The embrace they shared was brief but fierce. Two people who had weathered too many storms to waste time on lengthy reunions when there was work to be done. "How is she?" Jack asked, as they drove through the familiar streets of Maplewood, noting how the town's peaceful facade now felt like a mockery. "Broken," Rose replied simply. "She hasn't eaten more than a few bites since it happened. She keeps asking me why the policeman hurt Liberty when Liberty was being good. How do you explain evil to a child who only knows love?" At Maplewood General, Jack found Emma curled in the fetal position on her hospital bed, clutching Liberty's collar so tightly that the leather had left marks on her palms. When she saw him, her face crumpled, and she launched herself into his arms with a desperate intensity that nearly broke his carefully maintained composure. "Daddy," she sobbed against his chest. "They killed Liberty. She wasn't doing anything wrong, but they killed her anyway. She died trying to protect me, and I couldn't save her." Jack held his daughter close, feeling her small body shake with grief, while his own mind began the cold calculation of a man trained to eliminate threats. But this wasn't a battlefield in some distant country. This was home, and the enemy wore badges and hid behind the very system designed to protect innocent people. Over the next week, Jack began his investigation with the methodical precision that had made him one of Delta Force's most effective operators. What he discovered chilled him to the bone, not just because of its cruelty, but because of its calculated nature. The pattern became clear as Jack delved deeper into Brooks' background. 5 years earlier, Brooks' 6-year-old son Tommy had been attacked by a German Shepherd in what neighbors described as an unprovoked assault. The boy had required extensive plastic surgery, leaving him with permanent scarring and a phobia of large dogs that haunted his young life. The incident had destroyed Brooks's marriage, as his wife blamed him for not being able to protect their son, and she had moved across the country with Tommy, cutting off all contact. But the dog that had attacked Tommy Brooks hadn't been just any German Shepherd, it had been Liberty. Jack stared at the veterinary records he had obtained through military channels, his hands trembling slightly as the pieces fell into place. Liberty's original family, the Morrisons, Sheriff Morrison's relatives, had surrendered her to animal control after the attack, claiming they couldn't handle her aggressive behavior. She had been rehabilitated by a specialized facility and eventually placed through the military service dog program, where her gentle nature and protective instincts had been channeled into therapy work. The dog that had saved Emma's life, that had spent 18 months healing her trauma and teaching her to trust again, was the same dog that had once destroyed another child's innocence. The irony was devastating and perfect, and Brooks had known it all along. Jack's investigation revealed that Brooks had been monitoring the military service dog placements for years, waiting for Liberty to surface. When the Sullivan family had moved to Maplewood and registered Liberty with the local veterinarian, Brooks had finally found his target. The shooting hadn't been a split-second decision born of fear or misunderstanding. It had been the culmination of a 5-year plan for revenge. But there was more. As Jack dug deeper, he uncovered evidence that Brooks's corruption extended far beyond personal vendettas. Working with his father, Sheriff Morrison, Brooks had been systematically targeting military families who moved to Maplewood, using harassment and intimidation to force them out of the community. The goal wasn't just personal, it was ideological, part of a broader effort to maintain what they saw as the town's traditional character. The most devastating revelation came when Jack discovered the truth about Michelle's death. What had been ruled an accident during a snowstorm 2 years earlier had actually been murder. Michelle Sullivan, working as a part-time bookkeeper for the town, had discovered financial irregularities that pointed to Morrison and Brooks skimming money from federal grants meant for veteran services. When she had threatened to report her findings, Brooks had tampered with her car's brakes, ensuring that her drive home during the storm would be her last. Jack sat in his study at 3 a.m, staring at the evidence spread across his desk. Financial records, witness statements, surveillance footage, phone records, all painting a picture of corruption so complete it took his breath away. They hadn't just killed Liberty. They hadn't just traumatized Emma. They had murdered his wife and gotten away with it for 2 years. The realization hit him like a physical blow, doubling him over in his chair as grief and rage warred within him. Michelle had died because she had tried to do the right thing, tried to protect the very veterans her husband served alongside. She had died alone and afraid on a dark winter road, probably never understanding why her brakes had failed at the worst possible moment. Upstairs, Emma cried out in her sleep. The nightmares that Liberty had once chased away, now free to torment her unprotected mind. Jack climbed the stairs to comfort his daughter, finding her thrashing in sheets soaked with sweat, calling for Liberty to come help her. "Shh, sweetheart," he whispered, gathering her in his arms. "Daddy's here. You're safe." But Emma's eyes opened wide with a clarity that was heartbreaking in its simplicity. "Daddy, are you going to hurt the policeman who killed Liberty?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with all the weight of a father's love and a soldier's training. Jack could feel the pistol in his nightstand drawer calling to him, could imagine how easy it would be to end Brooks and Morrison with the skills he had honed over 2 decades of military service. He could make it look like an accident, could disappear them so completely that their bodies would never be found. But Emma was watching him with those dark eyes so much like her mother's, waiting for an answer that would shape how she saw the world for the rest of her life. "No, baby," Jack said finally, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his heart. "I'm going to make sure he faces justice. Real justice, not the kind that comes from anger or revenge. Liberty wouldn't want us to become like the people who hurt her." Emma nodded slowly, then curled against his chest with a sigh that seemed too heavy for such a small person. "Liberty was good," she whispered. She would want other dogs to be safe. As Jack held his daughter, he made a decision that would have surprised his Delta Force commanders, but would have made Michelle proud. He would not become the monster that Brooks and Morrison expected him to be. He would not give them the excuse they needed to paint him as an unstable veteran seeking vigilante justice. Instead, he would do something far more devastating. He would expose their corruption completely, systematically destroying their lives through the very legal system they had corrupted. He would use every resource at his disposal, every contact he had made during 2 decades of classified operations, every favor owed to him by senators and generals and intelligence operatives. They had killed his wife and his daughter's best friend, had traumatized his child and thought their badges would protect them from consequences. They were about to learn that some enemies are too dangerous to leave alive, and sometimes the most devastating weapon is the truth itself. The war Brooks and Morrison had started was about to become very real, but it would be fought in courtrooms and congressional hearings, in newspaper headlines and federal investigations. And when it was over, justice would be served not just for Liberty and Michelle, but for every family they had terrorized in their quest to maintain their twisted vision of American purity. Emma fell back asleep in her father's arms, and for the first time since Liberty's death, her dreams were peaceful. 6 months after Liberty's death, the federal courthouse in Burlington buzzed with an energy that hadn't been seen since the state's most notorious corruption trials of the previous decade. Emma Sullivan, now 13 and stronger than anyone had dared hope, sat in the front row beside her father and grandmother, wearing a navy blue dress that her mother would have loved, and clutching a small photo of Liberty in her hands. The transformation in Emma had been gradual but profound. The selective mutism that had plagued her since her mother's death had given way to a quiet strength that impressed even her therapist. She had found her voice not through therapy alone, but through purpose. The burning need to ensure that Liberty's death meant something, that other children and their beloved companions would be protected from the evil that had destroyed her world. Judge Patricia Whitmore, a stern woman with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much injustice, called the court to order as FBI Special Agent Maria Santos approached the prosecutor's table. The federal investigation that Jack Sullivan had set in motion through his military contacts had grown into something unprecedented, a corruption case that reached into every corner of Maplewood's power structure. "Your Honor," Agent Santos began, her voice carrying the weight of months of painstaking investigation, "the evidence will show that former Sheriff Morrison and former Officer Brooks engaged in a systematic campaign of corruption, civil rights violations, and murder that spans nearly a decade. What began as a personal vendetta became a conspiracy to terrorize military families and steal federal funds meant to support our nation's veterans." In the defendant's section, Ryan Brooks sat hunched over the defense table, his once confident demeanor replaced by the hollow look of a man whose carefully constructed world had collapsed. Beside him, Morrison maintained his dignity with the stubborn pride of someone who still believed he was the victim of an elaborate misunderstanding, despite the mountain of evidence against him. The first witness called was Mrs. Henderson, now 83, but still sharp as her late husband's razor. Her weathered hands shook slightly as she placed them on the Bible, but her voice was clear and strong as she recounted what she had witnessed that September afternoon in the cemetery. I saw a child and her service dog being terrorized by men who were supposed to protect them, she testified, her eyes never leaving Brooks's face. That dog wasn't aggressive. She was protective. There's a difference, and any decent human being should know it. The video Mrs. Henderson had recorded on her phone played on the courtroom's large screens, and several jurors visibly flinched as they watched Liberty die. Emma's testimony would come later, but her presence in the courtroom served as a living reminder of the human cost of the defendant's crimes. Officer Walsh, now working security at a private firm after resigning from the force in disgrace, took the stand with the bearing of a man carrying an enormous burden. His testimony proved devastating to the defense. "I knew it was wrong," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I knew that dog wasn't attacking anyone, but Brooks was my training officer. He controlled my career, my future. I convinced myself that he must know something I didn't, that he had experience I lacked. I was a coward, and a child, and her dog paid the price for my cowardice." The evidence of financial corruption emerged piece by piece through the testimony of federal auditors and former town employees. Morrison and Brooks had been skimming money from federal veterans assistance programs for years, using their positions to redirect funds meant for housing assistance, job training, and mental health services into their own accounts. The total amount exceeded $2 million over 8 years. But it was the revelation about Michelle Sullivan's murder that brought the courtroom to stunned silence. FBI forensics expert Dr. James Mitchell presented evidence that Michelle's car had been sabotaged, the brake lines deliberately severed in a way that would cause catastrophic failure during heavy use, like driving down a mountain road during a snowstorm. Mrs. Sullivan discovered the financial irregularities during her work as a part-time bookkeeper, Dr. Mitchell explained. Phone records show she contacted the FBI's fraud hotline 2 days before her death. She was planning to turn over evidence the following week. Jack Sullivan's own testimony was brief but powerful. The decorated colonel spoke with the controlled emotion of a man who had learned to channel grief into purpose, describing how his wife's death had been ruled an accident while the real killers walked free, how his daughter's trauma had been dismissed as collateral damage in their war against military families. "They didn't just kill my wife and terrorize my daughter," Jack said, his voice steady despite the pain evident in his eyes. "They violated everything that uniform is supposed to represent. They turned the badge into a weapon against the very people it's meant to protect." When Emma finally took the stand, the courtroom fell completely silent. Her small figure seemed dwarfed by the witness chair, but her voice was clear and strong as she spoke about Liberty, about the bond they had shared, about the love and protection her four-legged guardian had provided. "Liberty wasn't just my dog," Emma said, looking directly at the jury. "She was my translator when I couldn't find words, my protector when I couldn't protect myself, my friend when I felt alone in the world. She taught me that love doesn't have to speak to be understood, that loyalty doesn't need rewards to be real." Emma's voice wavered slightly as she continued. "When Officer Brooks pointed his gun at us, Liberty could have run away. She was fast and strong and smart, but she stayed between me and danger because that's what love does. It doesn't run away when things get scary. It stays and protects what matters most." The courtroom was absolutely silent as Emma concluded her testimony. "I don't hate Officer Brooks," she said, surprising everyone, including the defense attorneys. "Liberty taught me that hate only makes more hurt in the world, but justice isn't hate. Justice is making sure that what happened to Liberty and my mama can't happen to other families. Justice is keeping promises to people who can't speak for themselves anymore." Brooks's defense attorney, a skilled lawyer from Boston, tried valiantly to paint his client as a man driven to extremes by his own trauma, by the pain of watching his son suffer. But the evidence was overwhelming, the pattern of corruption too extensive, the cruelty too calculated to be explained away by personal grief. The trial's final revelation came when Agent Santos presented wiretap evidence of conversations between Brooks and Morrison discussing their cleansing efforts, their systematic campaign to drive military families out of Maplewood to preserve what they saw as the community's traditional character. "We can't let these people think they belong here," Brooks's voice echoed through the courtroom speakers. "Veterans think they're heroes, think their service entitles them to special treatment. But this is our town, our community. We decide who belongs." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts. Brooks was sentenced to life without parole for Michelle's murder, plus additional decades for civil rights violations, animal cruelty, and conspiracy charges. Morrison received 25 years for his role in the corruption and cover-up. As the verdicts were read, Emma reached for her father's hand, finding strength in his presence, just as she had once found comfort in Liberty's. Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for statements, but the Sullivan family walked past them with quiet dignity, their focus on healing rather than revenge. That evening, as spring rain fell gently on Maplewood streets, Emma sat on her front porch with Hope, the young German shepherd they had adopted 3 months earlier. Hope wasn't a replacement for Liberty. Nothing could ever replace that bond. But she was a continuation of the love that Liberty had taught Emma to give and receive. "Do you think Liberty knows?" Emma asked Rose, who sat beside her on the porch swing they had shared for so many years. "Oh, sweetheart," Rose replied, her voice soft with certainty. "Liberty knows. And she's proud of you for turning your pain into purpose, your grief into grace." As the rain continued to fall, washing the world clean, Emma felt something she hadn't experienced since that terrible September afternoon. Peace. Justice had been served, truth had prevailed, and love had proven stronger than hate. Liberty's sacrifice had not been in vain. The healing could finally begin. 1 year after the trial, Emma Sullivan stood at the podium of Maplewood Elementary School's auditorium, looking out at an audience of children, parents, and community members who had gathered for the dedication of the Liberty Memorial Garden. At 14, she had grown taller, stronger, and more confident, but the gentle wisdom in her dark eyes remained unchanged, a testament to the love that had shaped her even in the darkest of times. The garden itself was a masterpiece of community collaboration, designed by local landscapers and built by volunteers who had donated hundreds of hours to honor the memory of a dog who had become a symbol of unconditional love and sacrifice. Golden marigolds and deep purple pansies bordered winding pathways that led to a central memorial stone bearing Liberty's image and the simple inscription, "She loved without condition, protected without question, and lives forever in the hearts she touched." "When I was 12, Emma began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system, "I thought love was something that could be taken away from you. I thought that when someone you loved died, that love died with them. But Liberty taught me something different. She taught me that love doesn't end when the heart stops beating. It just changes shape." In the front row, Rose Sullivan dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief that had belonged to her mother, while Jack sat proudly beside her, his military posture softened by the profound peace that had settled over their family in recent months. The lawsuit settlements from the town and state had provided financial security, but more importantly, the truth had provided closure. Liberty's love didn't disappear when she died, Emma continued, her gaze finding the familiar faces of neighbors who had become like family over the past months of healing. It transformed into something bigger. It became the courage that helped my family seek justice. It became the strength that brought our community together. It became the hope that helps other children and their service animals live safely. Mrs. Henderson, now 84 and still spry enough to tend her roses, nodded approvingly from her wheelchair in the front section. She had become something of a local celebrity after her testimony, her phone video viewed millions of times online, and her courage cited as an example of how ordinary citizens could stand up to injustice. The experience had given her a new lease on life, and she had started a nonprofit organization to train seniors in citizen journalism and community advocacy. Hope, now a mature 18-month-old German shepherd, sat quietly beside Jack's chair, her intelligent brown eyes scanning the crowd with the calm alertness of a dog who understood her important role. She wore a special collar today, one adorned with a small silver charm in the shape of a maple leaf, a gift from the town council as recognition of her own service to the community. "Liberty taught me that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared," Emma said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "It means you do what's right even when you are scared." She was afraid that day in the cemetery, but she stayed between me and danger because that's what love does. Love doesn't run away when things get hard. Love stays and protects what matters most. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word as Emma shared the wisdom that had carried her through the darkest period of her young life. In the back of the auditorium, several news reporters took notes, recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. A child who had transformed trauma into triumph, who had turned grief into grace. Some people might say that Liberty was just a dog, Emma continued, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. But anyone who says that has never felt the kind of love that asks for nothing in return. They've never experienced the loyalty that doesn't keep score, the faithfulness that doesn't demand perfection. They've never known what it feels like to be completely understood by someone who never speaks a word. Rose felt her heart swell with pride as she listened to her granddaughter speak with such eloquence and wisdom. The child who had once struggled to find words had become a powerful voice for justice and compassion, her autism transformed from a limitation into a unique perspective that allowed her to see truth with startling clarity. The Liberty Memorial Garden isn't just about remembering one special dog, Emma explained as she gestured toward the large windows that looked out on the beautiful space. It's about remembering what she represents, the power of unconditional love, the importance of protecting those who can't protect themselves, and the truth that real strength comes from serving others rather than ourselves. Jack thought about the past year and how dramatically their lives had changed. The military had honored his request for a permanent assignment stateside, allowing him to take a position training other Special Forces soldiers while remaining close to his family. The nightmares that had plagued him since Michelle's death had finally begun to fade, replaced by a sense of purpose that went beyond military service. "Today, we're not just dedicating a garden," Emma said, her voice taking on the cadence of someone who had learned to speak from the heart. "We're making a promise. We're promising that Liberty's death will continue to mean something, that her sacrifice will protect other families from the kind of hatred and corruption that destroyed our peace." The Liberty Foundation, established with funds from the legal settlements, had already begun its work of providing service dogs to military families and supporting legislation to strengthen penalties for crimes against service animals. Emma served on the Junior Advisory Board, her unique perspective helping to shape programs that would benefit thousands of children and veterans across the country. "I want to tell you about the letter I received last week," Emma said, pulling a folded piece of paper from her pocket. It came from a little boy in Texas whose service dog was protected by a police officer who remembered Liberty's story. That officer chose to de-escalate instead of reaching for his weapon. He chose to see a child and his companion instead of a threat. That's Liberty's love continuing to work in the world. Hope rose from her position beside Jack's chair and padded quietly to Emma's side, sitting perfectly at heel as she had been trained. The sight of the young woman and her guardian standing together in the soft auditorium lighting created an image that many in the audience would remember for the rest of their lives. "Liberty lives on in hope," Emma said, her hand resting gently on her new companion's head. "But she also lives on in every act of kindness, every moment of protection, every choice to love instead of hate. She lives on in this garden where children will come to learn about compassion, where families will find peace, where the community will remember what really matters." As Emma concluded her speech, the audience rose in spontaneous applause that seemed to go on forever. But more than the clapping, it was the expressions on their faces that told the real story. Tears of healing, smiles of hope, and the kind of peace that comes when justice has been served and love has triumphed over hate. Later, as the sun set over Maplewood and the last visitors left the memorial garden, Emma sat on the bench dedicated to her mother's memory, with Hope beside her and her family surrounding her. The maple trees that gave the town its name rustled gently in the evening breeze, their leaves catching the golden light like nature's own celebration. "Do you think they're together now?" Emma asked quietly, her gaze fixed on the memorial stone where Liberty's image seemed to glow in the fading light. "Mama and Liberty?" Rose took her granddaughter's hand, feeling the calluses that had formed from months of training Hope and volunteering at the animal shelter. "Oh, sweetheart," she said with absolute certainty, "I know they are, and I know they're both proud of the woman you're becoming." As darkness fell over the peaceful town of Maplewood, the memorial garden's soft lighting illuminated the pathways where future generations would come to learn about love, sacrifice, and the enduring power of hope. Liberty's story had ended with her death, but her legacy would live forever in the hearts and minds of all who understood that true love never really dies. It just finds new ways to protect and heal the world. Dear friends, Emma's journey reminds us that our greatest tragedies can become our most powerful testimonies. In a world that often feels divided, her story shows us that love, justice, and community still matter. We may have faced losses that seemed unbearable, watched injustices that made us question everything, or felt powerless against systems that seemed rigged against ordinary people. But Emma's courage and Liberty's sacrifice reminds us that every act of love creates ripples of hope that can change the world. Like Rose Sullivan, we're never too old to fight for what's right, to stand up for those who can't speak for themselves, or to turn our pain into purpose. What moment in your own life taught you that love is stronger than loss? Have you ever had a four-legged family member who showed you the meaning of unconditional loyalty? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.